Hey, look at his face. He won't be any help. What do you mean? Now I recognize him, the first deputy said. It's the Westergaard boy. Kyle opened his fingers and peeked through them to see the first deputy gesture by rotating his index finger in a circle around his right ear. The other deputy nodded, then looked back at Kyle with sympathy on his face. Then, gently, son, turn that bike around. Go finish your route. There might be someone out there stupid enough to want to read the Grimstead Tribune. The second deputy laughed at that. Kyle was hurt by that index finger in a circle thing. Of course he'd seen it before, but he was even more hurt by that look the second deputy gave him, that look of pity. It wasn't fair. He stopped at the bundle and lowered his kickstand. After transferring all the papers from the right pannier into the ink-stained left pannier, he lifted the bundle and dropped it into the empty bag. It felt like there were bags of sand inside. The bundle outweighed the newspapers and it would make his bike list, but it wasn't as clumsy as he thought it would be. Then he started pedaling back up the trail. The incline would make it hard work. Kyle's hands were freezing, and that bundle was heavy. And of course, Kyle takes the bundle home to his mom, and his mom is living with probably the only unemployed person in North Dakota, a guy named T-Lock, who, once he finds out what's in that bundle, which is drugs, black tar, heroin, meth, and cash, comes up with a great plan to get rid of it and to sell it. Kyle, meanwhile, kind of likes the idea because this is the one time he thinks he can take care of his mom. Who's a single mom, kind of tragic lady, but Kyle loves her to death, and he thinks that he's going to go with it this time. And meanwhile, Cassie Duell, who was introduced in the highway, she's 36 years old. She's a single mother as well, war widow from Afghanistan, has a 10-year-old boy. And at the very beginning of the book, she's on her way to North Carolina because the sheriff's department there thinks they have apprehended the Lizard King, the serial killer truck driver. And since she's the only one who's ever seen him, she's being sent there to identify him. At the same time, she has applied for the chief investigator job at the Bakken County, North Dakota Sheriff's Department, and she accepts that job en route. And the reason she takes it is because there's a huge oil boom going on in North Dakota. I don't know how many people know about that. It's the Bakken's western North Dakota. And she takes this job, she drives there, and we sort of see this area, this huge brand new Wild West boomtown, through her eyes. She's immediately thrust in the middle of a drug war that's going on between two gangs, which is based on my research there last year. The local motorcycle gang that branched out of Denver that controlled most of the drugs, and then MS-13, the most violent gang in America that's moving in to take over. So the story is told from her point of view, moving into this community, taking a new job in a place where it's about 30-to-1 men to women in the oil fields, and it's told from the perspective of Kyle, who has fetal alcohol syndrome, a mild form of it, but who is, because of his disability, is just sort of invisible in this community, although he's in the middle of everything. So eventually it goes on like that, and eventually they meet. It's one of my favorite books, I have to say. I think it's, I don't usually say that, but this one was just really tight. And I was so inspired by the setting because it was such a, I knew having lived, living in Wyoming, so many friends and relatives were immigrating to North Dakota, and it's so odd because in Wyoming and Montana we make fun of people from North Dakota, and more Montana's like that. And North Dakota up until recently really was a place where people were from. It was one of the few states losing population every census. And there was even talk a few years ago that maybe they should just turn that big area into a buffalo common, since nobody really wanted to live there except Norwegian and German farmers that were out there. But when they figured out how to get at this oil, the town of Grimstead, by the way, is based on Williston, North Dakota, which is kind of the beating heart of the Bakken. And in the last 10 years, it's totally transformed that whole area. The Williston, North Dakota I think 6 years ago, had 10,000 people. Now they estimate 80 to 100,000, almost all men. Of course, the housing has not been able to catch up, so most of them are staying in temporary housing out on the prairie, and they call them man camps or lodges. And just the atmosphere of that many men making really high salaries without women, all the elements are there for a big story. So I enjoyed researching it. I enjoyed writing it. A lot of the facts about the area are in the book. It's one of those weird kind of under the radar things. This huge, all this oil from North Dakota. And I got some of the facts on it, just if you're not aware. 20% of all of the oil consumed in the United States now is from North Dakota. That state has gone from nothing to the second largest oil producer behind Texas within 4 years. And 100 one-mile long trains of oil go out of Williston every day to every corner of the U.S. There's no pipelines yet. It's all on trains or on trucks. And you may have heard of a couple of the accidents that they've had, because it's very volatile kind of oil, but the pipelines aren't there. It's the only way to transport it. So it's a very, very, kind of amazing thing that happened in the middle of nowhere and kind of under the radar. In fact, if you go Google North Dakota at night, there's some photos that NPR did a story a few years ago where if you look at the northern part of the U.S. At night from a satellite photo, you can't tell, unless you're really good with geography, which one's Chicago, which one's Minneapolis, and which one's Williston, North Dakota, because of the flaring, because they're burning off that natural gas. They're eventually getting pipelines there. They won't be having flares anymore, but for now it's still like that. And the boom, even though the price of oil has dropped in half, the boom still continues because they can get it so cheaply and almost every well it is successful. So a lot of unemployment around the U.S. Everybody should say go to Williston. It's like 0.05% unemployment rate. And when I was there, the sheriff, sometimes it's difficult for a writer to get in with law enforcement because sometimes, especially sheriffs, it's a political job too, and sometimes they don't want to say too much. But it turned out the sheriff who was there was the sheriff when it was about 10,000 people, and he's still the sheriff now that it's booming. And he turned out to be a fan of the book. So he took me around for 2.5 days, and we saw everything. Went to the man camps, went to the jail. He actually identified a couple of MS-13 gang members on the street of Williston, North Dakota, which wasn't that hard. I could identify them. But it was also 20 below, and they were freezing to death. And the juxtaposition of this kind of urban gang warfare going on in a place that was just farms a few years ago is pretty wild. So with that setting, I wrote the book, and I incorporated a lot of things I learned on that trip into this, and which is one reason why it's one of my favorites. So I hope you like it, and there's a kind of a thread hanging open on the end, I'll tell you that right now. Not the main one, but which means I'm probably going to revisit this area and Cassie Duell again. She's so much fun to write. Same with Kyle. So I'll stop there. Be happy to answer any questions about this book, North Dakota, Joe Pickett, me, whatever.
I have a question.
Yes.
You just kind of touched on story arcs. Do you do story arcs beyond one book at a time?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I have not plotted that far out, and I don't think I'm ever going to. Usually when I finish a book, especially if it's in the series, in the Joe Pickett series, I usually have 4 or 5 ideas kind of hanging out there, and I try to choose which one works best right after the last book. And then I work it like that each time. But I think, and I see this with some writers and sometimes with people trying to get, the fledgling writers who want to get a series going, they tend to hold back things because they're going to do it later. And I think if you think like that, I think the reader realizes you're holding back too. So I think I try to put everything into every book and then figure out what's next, as opposed to, leaving too much hanging because I'm going to cover it in the next book. I don't think that's exactly fair to the reader. Yes?
What made you make a transition from Joe Pickett to this?
Well, this is the fifth standalone, or the fifth outside the series. Mainly, it's when I got an idea or want to set a story someplace other than Wyoming, it makes a lot more sense to do it in a standalone. Like the book Blue Heaven, the one we talked about, the Edgar Ward book, that had to be in North Idaho because that's where it actually took place, where all the Southern California ex-cops wound up. They were in around Sandpoint, Idaho, so to set that somewhere else wouldn't have made sense. So that's pretty much what it is. I reserved Wyoming for Joe Pickett, and all the other standalones are in the state surrounding. Yes.
Is there gonna be another Joe Pickett?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
I'm about 2 chapters away from the end of it. It'll be out next March.
And also in North Dakota, I understand around that things, there's also a lot of young women that get trafficked in there and sold into prostitution.
That it is, that was really, I expected a lot more of that. And when I talked to the sheriff, when with that many men, you just know it's going to happen. It's all done on the internet, primarily in escort services. There's not a lot of pimps around. There are no houses of prostitution. There's just people making dates via the internet. But where they concentrate on the trafficking, they almost don't care about normal prostitution because he says we have a lot bigger things to worry about than that. But the trafficking, they really go after. And there is some of that, but they've also shut down most of it. He feels pretty confident they've gotten most of it once it gets going. Yeah, that's weird, it's wild stuff. Yes?
Okay, so this has to do with the highway.
Okay.
It's a spoiler.
No spoilers.
It's a big question. It's a big question though with the highway, and you have Cody Hoyt,
Okay, getting into spoiler territory. We'll talk about it up here. How's that? Because for those who haven't read it, we don't want to give away too much, unless it's not a question like
No,
that.
it's a question.
Okay.
I'm sure you know what it is. I can't say it because it's a spoiler.
But we can talk about it.
Up there, then that's fine.
Okay. Has everybody read The Highway?
Yeah,
we have.
Anyone not? Okay, if everybody read it, we can do it. You don't have to have read The Highway to take up Badlands, but I think it would be richer if you did, because you'd know these references back. But you don't have to. I'm not trying to sell you two books. But we'll talk about it later, okay? Yes.
The last book I read that had Missy in it, she was married to a rich man and she came to this.
That was Stone Cold in the Joe Pickett series.
The guy had this nefarious way of getting rid of him.
And she was flying away in his private plane
Yes,
and
and
never
she's coming back.
escaping.
She's so evil.
No doubt she'll come back. She's too mean to die. So yeah, she'll, at some point, she will. Yes?
Is she modeled on anybody you know?
What I like to say is she's not based on my mother-in-law, because my mother-in-law's worse. That's just a cheap laugh joke. My mother-in-law's quite a fan of the books. But no, she's not based on anybody in particular. And sometimes characters, I'm a big outliner. I start the book, I research whatever the subject matter is going to be, then I sort of figure out a way to, in my mind, pull a reader through that theme or controversy in a page-turning way. And I don't, sometimes things happen. And in the third book, Winter Kill, both Nate Romanowski and Missy were introduced. And you're talking about the story arc. I wasn't thinking these people were going to be in future novels. They were just side characters, and I enjoyed writing them so much, and they worked so well within it that they've continued on. So. Yes, sir.
I'm from Wyoming,
Oh, where?
and Casper, went to school in Laramie.
Okay, cool.
Lived in Sheridan, Cheyenne, worked in broadcasting.
Okay.
I've been out here about 40 years, live up in San Anselmo. And, when people said, now, where are you from? So I said, from Wyoming. They said, oh, God, it's a beautiful place. We went to Jackson Hole one summer.
Right.
And I said, God, it's really neat. We went to Yellowstone, etc. And they said, well, do you like it there? Do you miss it? And I said, well, I live in Northern California for a reason. And I think that you and I both know what that reason is. But I say, if you want to,
Because you like traffic?
you have to be very strategic about the traffic. You have to say when to go and when not to go. If you're going to come up here and think that you can take rush hour traffic out of San Francisco on a Friday night,
Yeah.
that was the plan to had a little bit more. But the point being is that I could tell people about Wyoming. And and being in Northern California, it has a lot of cultural and philosophic differences.
Oh, sure.
However, I've got the stack of the CJ box, the Joe Pickett books
Great.
in paperback, and I say, here, why don't you get started on this and go down through them, and you'll have an understanding of the essence of what the culture of the state is about, I love to go back. I love to visit the friends that I grew up with and went to school with. I couldn't go back there to live, for a lot of reasons. And you all don't have the earthquakes, but we don't have the long winters.
No, that's true. And that's, that is one of the reasons, before I ever published a book, one of my goals was that I felt that most of because I tried to read everything I could find that was either written about Wyoming or the Mountain West, or written by somebody from there. And I mean, I really did. And there were some great books, great writers in Montana. There's still, Thomas McGuane's still my favorite author.
Yeah.
But I couldn't find really too much set in Wyoming that I felt was authentic. There were books set there. There were people who lived in Jackson Hole who wrote about it for vacation, but I never felt there was a very authentic voice. So that I decided, the one thing I'd be happy with if I ever got a book published was that people would go, well, it rings true. So thanks.
Where did you go to school?
In Casper.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to Kelly Wells High School in Casper, and then I
Okay.
went to University of Denver on a journalism scholarship.
So you didn't go to
Then I went
Laramie?
back. No, I did. I actually could go to Denver cheaper. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's
I went to NCHS.
Oh, okay. Was there a Kelly Walsh then?
There was. I was at the last
Sorry, everyone.
The last full graduating class at NC, the senior year, and then they split
Okay.
into two.
I call it, I think I've even referenced it in the book, within people from Wyoming, there's 1 degree of separation. So we probably know, but
Sure.
we won't do this now. Yes, ma'am.
So
Oh,
I
I'm
don't-
sorry, you're next, sir.
I don't have a question, I just wanted, can I say 2 appreciation things?
Of course.
So
Go on and on and on.
being from California and not ever having held a gun, and I'm not into hunting and all of that stuff, but I really like how you present so many different sides of the issue in the book.
Thanks.
And that it's not all one-sided, and that it makes you think about all the different sides, and other people who are so pro-gun, it presents some of their sides, their points of view, so that you see that side of it too. And then the other thing is, I love your books, but I don't actually like all the violence in them. So one of the things that makes me really come back to them is the family aspect of
Great.
it. I love Joe Pickett's family and seeing how they grow
I
up.
love to hear that. That's actually, strangely enough, that's one of that's a part of every book I enjoy the most is writing about the family and the interaction and the girls. And so thanks. And for the other, I do have sometimes controversial subject matter, especially when it comes to environmentalism and resource management, all that kind of thing, hunting versus. But what I try to do, which thanks, is research it, present both sides, usually through somebody's character saying things.
Mhm.
And I trust the reader to come down where they may. I don't try to write agenda books.
Right.
And it's just like this one with Badlands. The sheriff up there, who I did spend quite a bit of time with, said he's no longer talking to reporters or journalists because everyone who shows up, travels all that way, has had already pretty much written their either Paradise Lost or Paradise Found story. And all they want him to do is give them a quote to confirm what they've already decided. And he said, I'm just not going to do it anymore. It's, I'm just sort of a tool. They don't really listen to anything. If they want to come out and say, we've destroyed North Dakota, they're going to say it. Or if they want to say, great economic boom town, good for us, they're going to say it. Doesn't matter what I say. So I try not to do that. But I did ask them a lot of tough questions. I mean, one was about fracking itself. This is the heart of that. And I said, have there been any major environmental problems? And he said, not yet. But this is over 40,000 wells. And there hasn't been a spill, there hasn't been groundwater pollution, there hasn't been an earthquake. Not to say it won't happen, but can't all say it's good either, because when all that trains on railroads, on trains, they're going through every major city in America, as opposed to pipelines, there's inevitably going to be a problem.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Yes, sir.
When you sort of referenced it on the, paradise lost, paradise gained, but it seemed like there'd be a lot to mine of the rivalry or resentment of some locals about some things that have changed. I mean,
Absolutely.
everybody wants the economy to be up, but once people come in and act like they run a place where you're from, people would get.
Absolutely.
And
That.
also, I guess if I was from Wyoming, I'd want a lot more than 1 degree of separation from me and and Dick Cheney.
Yeah. You're talking about that.
Hey, Dick Cheney went to my high school, and I had the same teachers that he did.
And my mom and his mom were great friends. They would live half a block away. That's the degree of separation. But no, as far as the resentment goes, actually I used the quote in the book. This sheriff is quite well read, and he's kind of a cowboy philosopher. And he gave me a little line once. We were talking about that. He said there's a lot of mourning around here. He said the people who are here mourn what they used to have, and the people who have moved here mourn from where they left. And I thought that put it probably better than I could have.
That's pretty interesting.
Yes. Yes.
I'm biggest fan of Joe Piggott, of course.
Great,
And
thanks.
to me, Joe is such a straightforward, honest, gosh guy. And the other side is Nate.
Right.
I adore Nate.
Yes.
Nate is very complex, his moral code is strong, but he's special.
But it's an amoral.
Can you talk a little bit about Nate? Yeah. Just tell us a little about Nate. Is he based on someone?
He is. Most of the characters are not based on anybody, really. But I've met a lot of game wardens over the years who could be Joe Piggott, but at the time I was writing him, I didn't have one in mind. But Nate's based on a guy I grew up with in Wyoming. He was a year ahead of me in high school. He was the big middle linebacker. He was a big blonde guy. He was a falconer, and I got to be friends with him through that because I was fascinated with it. So I went falconry hunting with him quite a bit. I didn't ever have a falcon, but I learned a lot, and I learned met a lot of other falconers. And then he went off to the Air Force Academy, and then Special Forces. And he's not as crazy violent as Nate, but that the mindset that comes with very serious falconers. I think most falconers who read my books think I've got it right. You've got a total dedication to that, to falconry. Your whole life has to revolve around it, or you're not a good falconer. So it's kind of to the exclusion of all else, and you have a different view of the circle of life, because every day you've got to go kill something. To feed your bird if nothing else, or the bird will do it themselves.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
Jeez, I don't know which book it is, but Nate teaches, he's taking Sheridan under him, he's teaching her falconry. And then it kind of dropped off when she went to university. Is that going to continue? Is she going to become more of a character in the book and more of the falconry type of mindset, type like Nate?
Possibly. Like I said, I'm not looking that far ahead, but the next book, the one that comes out next March, it's going to be called Off the Grid. It's much more of a Nate book. And Sheridan has a much larger role in it than in the previous one. So maybe, not trying to be secretive. She's in college,
Yeah.
but she's got a big part in the next one.
You coming back
And
in March?
I don't, because it's a Nate book that the body count is really high. Yes, sir.
About the falconry, can you explain a little more about the hoods that they put on them and how often do they do that? For instance, talk about putting the hoods over the birds, right?
Right.
Yeah.
They put the hood on whenever they've got the falcon, whenever they're transporting the falcon, or whenever the falcon is in the mews, the little falcon house, or they just want the bird to be still. Because if the falcon can't see, it won't fly. I mean, they can get startled and just want to go do all sorts of stuff, and they can injure themselves, even if you've got a grip on them. So the hood just keeps them still. And as soon as you take that hood off, then they're looking around, trying to find something to go kill. Yes, sir.
In one of your last books, you had one of the bad guys wrestling elk.
Oh, yeah.
Is that a little over the top, or have you ever heard that happen before?
Yeah, that's in Danger.
Yeah.
And that's not a spoiler, that's just an incident, so we were okay with that. That I have been keeping, I had that story in my back pocket since I started the Joe Pickett series. Because one of the world champion rodeo cowboys, Ty Murray, who's married to the singer, Jewel.
Jewel.
Yeah.
Ty Murray is like a god in the rodeo world. But for years, he couldn't do a rodeo in Colorado because they caught him bulldogging elk up from snowmobiles. He'd drive, just like in the scene, ride right alongside of them, grab their antlers, force them down. So he knew if he went to Colorado, he'd be arrested. And I think they worked out something eventually, but I always thought, I gotta use that one.
Well, that's an interesting background.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I was gonna ask, like tonight you were reading something and the deputy says he's gutted. Do you get that sort of turn of a phrase from talking to people? Do you make it up out of thin air? Where does that kind of stuff come from? And talk a little bit about research.
Well, law enforcement guy, I love to go on ride-alongs with them, and it usually takes a day or two before they kind of start to trust you and start talking normally like they do to each other. But I think law enforcement's like, like social workers or anybody else, they have to kind of detach themselves and find dark humor in everything. And they'll say that kind of thing to each other. Of course, they wouldn't to the public. But yeah, I've heard them, make references, and I don't always write them down because I don't want them to stop telling me stuff. But then later I write it down. I mean, I can't say I've ever heard one say he's gutted. I just think that would be a natural thing for one of them to say. Especially it's sort of the town too. I was sort of indicating small town like that. They don't know the victim, but they don't expect to know the victim. Whereas before, they of course would have been concerned it was a local person.
I have another question. What's going on with the movie industry and you, and are there any projects that are in the works that we're going to see anytime soon?
Yeah, well, there's things going on. Blue Heaven, the book, is still under option for a feature film, and it has been for 6 years, and they haven't done anything yet. So I'm of two minds on it. It's not bad that every 18 months I get a big check and then they don't make a movie. That's okay. But it's kind of getting a little old, and probably the next time it comes up, I probably won't sign up and see if there's any more interest in it. If somebody will actually do something with it. But there's 2 television projects right now as we speak. One is Joe Pickett series. Robert Redford's the executive director, producer on that, and they had it placed last year, and then the network backed out at the last second, so they're trying for another one right now. And then with David E. Kelly, do you know him? The producer. He's a great guy, great writer.
McBeal guy?
What's that?
Ally McBeal guy?
Right. Michelle Pfeiffer's husband. He bought The Highway, and he's developing that into like a 7-episode show just based on that book. And if it goes well, then he's got Badlands too. And I read the pilot for The Highway, and it's good. And I knew what happened, and I thought it was really good. So those are being pitched right now, but there's nothing definitive. Yes?
So when you're writing the books, actually, who do you imagine reading them? Because when the first book we read was 3 Weeks to Say Goodbye. And then when we looked you up, this was like a while ago, so when we looked you up again, then we found the Joe Pickett novels.
Mhm.
And again, I don't know if we ever thought we'd be interested in a game warden in
Yeah.
Wyoming. But we were, so I'm just wondering, who do you imagine, the audience that you're, which market you want to read it?
Well, that's a really good question. I've never thought in those, I don't try to target the books to anybody.
Mhm.
I don't, I think then I would hold back things or maybe not include things. What I try to do is just write as straightforward, honest story as I can, and then just kind of see who likes it, as opposed to targeting it in any way.
Right.
I did the publishers now are doing, I guess that's one thing, luckily last book was number 2 in the New York Times, so they started paying a lot more attention to things, and they did a research and found out that 51% of my readers are women, so 49 are men. I've always said it's about 50-50 men and women, just based on people who come to the book signings. That's really unusual in publishing, because most books are mystery books are purchased by women.
Right.
And now I'm like 50-50. So I just think it has more to do with the subject matter, who it appeals to, as opposed to targeting anyone. Did I answer your question?
Sort of.
I mean, do I think of the two ladies in Lodi as I'm writing? Maybe. Yes.
I had a related question, because it was sort of, you've been talking in part of your answers about thinking about bringing the reader along, and so in that sense, you're not just telling a good straightforward story, but also, how it's going to be understood step by step
Well,
by step.
what I was referring to is pulling the reader through subject matter. So that's different than bringing them along. I'm thinking of, how do I write about wind energy or environmental terrorism or whatever without, show not tell. That's kind of the writer's thing. How do I build the story so that the aspects of all this controversy are in there, but it doesn't detract from the story and it doesn't slow it down. That's kind of what I'm thinking. So what I'm thinking.
Thank you for
If that
expanding.
answered that.
Yeah. Thank you for expanding.
Sure. Yes.
Can you talk in Joe Pickett's voice? Can you do a Joe Pickett imitation?
No. No, I can't. I have, there's a certain timbre to his voice that it's all kind of in my head, but I can't do it. I can't act it.
Who would you have him play?
I've never had an actor in mind, ever. I have a game warden in mind. My wife and daughters are always casting Joe Pickett, whoever the hot male actor of the year, but I've never really thought about it. The only one that my wife and I both kind of looked at each other and thought, oh, he'd be good, is Kyle Chandler, because we watched Friday Night Lights, and he's kind of a Joe Pickett-like character in that, with daughters, and he's kind of a little bit of a bumbler, but he's got a good code. He's a little old now for that role, but that's one that we both kind of thought, oh, he'd be good. Yes?
Do your wife and daughters give you ideas for the books?
They don't give me ideas, but they're my first readers and editors. I have 3 daughters and my wife, so what I did was, as soon as I'm done, I send them the manuscript, all 4 of them, and kind of give them a little deadline for send me their notes. And I usually incorporate almost all of that. With Badlands, for example, because half of it's told from a female protagonist, that was something I was a little bit nervous about. I've written young stuff from the perspective of a young girl, but I've never done something from the perspective of a 36-year-old kind of slightly overweight woman kind of over her head. So when I wrote it and I sent it out to my wife and daughters and to my editor who's female and my agent who's female, I just kept waiting to hear, and it was like the dog that didn't bark. No one came back and said, oh, a woman wouldn't say that, think that, act like that, and which to me was a wonderful compliment that no one brought it up. Sometimes male writers, when they write female characters, tend to over-sexualize them. And that when I read it, it always strikes me wrong. And I try not to do that. Yes?
Do your wife and daughters recognize any aspects of themselves in Joe Pickett's family?
Oh, sure. I use a lot, especially with the interplay in the family. There's a lot of things. The funny thing is that all my daughters think Sheridan is patterned after them. You know, and bad, crazy April. I don't know where she came from.
Anyone else?
Anything else?
Well, I wanted to also say something to Fraser. I think it's wonderful how his wife is such an independent person.
Oh, good.
You know, that she has her own career. She's not just sitting home waiting for Joe to come back. You know, she has her own ideas about everything. I think that maybe that's one of the reasons women read.
Could be. And Joe acknowledges that she's this much smarter of the two.
She is.
And she is.
She's had a lot of heartbreak.
There's
Yeah.
one
Oh,
back there.
yeah.
Ma'am, did you have a question?
I was just curious if you spent, Wyoming's not that complicated, I know, but do you spend some time in different communities when you're writing?
Mhm.
Because it rings true to me.
Thank you. Yeah, if I'm sending it in a part of the state that I'm not that familiar with, I go hang out there for a while. With Stone Cold, that one went up into around Newcastle, Sundance, Shula, the Black Hills of Wyoming.
I thought you were probably from Tinsley.
No, I'm actually from Casper
Yeah,
originally.
that's what I heard you
But I
say.
spent a lot of time up there. But I still like to do that. Sometimes even if there are communities or areas that I know pretty well, to go immerse yourself, for me, if I go just immerse myself there for a few days, I get the vibe or get a better vibe and I feel more comfortable about it.
You do a good job of it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yes, maybe this will be it. and then we'll-
Yeah.
Okay, yes,
I
sir.
just wanted to say, well, I guess that the women that are from there, from the countryside, have to be kind of pretty tough to be determined and make it through those winters. And
Mhm.
the first generations that came there, a lot of people had, brought wives over from Northern Europe, and they came to North Dakota,
Right.
and then they left after about 2 years, because you figure, no electricity and trying to keep the wind out in the middle of nowhere, they said, no, they're going back
Yeah, there's
home.
some great stories in journals of women pioneers, and they got really tough. I agree. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you again. I really appreciate you coming, and I'm happy.